Alright, welcome back everyone. Today I thought I would do a quick modern tier list with all of the decks that I've seen that are most popular. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot more that I'm missing, and the metagame is still pretty fresh off the bannings, but I thought this would be a good exercise to kind of go through and figure out what are the best decks post bannings and what I think are the best choices for going into an RCQ or another competitive tournament. So the way I set up the tiers is 1A is, I think those are the top decks that if you're going to an unknown store or a tournament where you don't know what the metagame is going to look like, those are the decks that I would make sure you have a plan against, and then you can kind of go from there. 1B is decks that are maybe a step below, but I think are still good enough to win tournaments, and depending on the metagame, could be actually a better choice than the decks up above them. Then I've got tier 2, which is decks that I think, again, I think they're another step behind 1B. I think you'd have to have a very specific metagame or some sort of new build that I think revolutionizes them a little bit, where they can gain a little bit of power, a little bit of consistency, and then also fight harder against the decks up at the top. And then don't play, I think is obvious. I don't think they're very good. I see them around, and I never see them doing well, and I think they have some problems that it can't really be resolved. So yeah, so let's get into it. So first deck up, I think, is no surprise. I think Boros Energy is the best deck in the format, and since the bannings has proven that to be true, and I'm including Nadu Energy in here. I think that there's obviously a lot of nuance between which one you want to play and what matchups you want to fight against, but I think since the core of the deck is the same, and the strategy is very similar, if I was going to separate them out, they would be the top two decks anyway. So I'm just going to combine them both into one here. Next up is Goro's Vengeance. I mean, I think it got Grief banned, but the deck is still super strong. I mean, it's got an extremely fast clock. It does still have Psychic Frog, which just adds another access that makes it very hard to play against. And then the new tech that I've seen a lot of decks playing Ulamog for when your Atraxas get exiled. You can just win the game that way too. It's just a very strong and consistent deck. All right, and then the next one I think is Tron. There's a lot of different builds of Tron, which I think adds a little bit to its power. You can kind of build it to fight against a lot of different metagames. Like you can play a little bit of a green splash to play Soy Mike Spawn or World Breaker. You can play just straight colorless build and start playing Trinispheres if that's what you feel like you need that. I mean, and then obviously just the raw power of the deck is just insane with Ugin's Labyrinth, Eldrazi Temple, and then Tron itself. Like, you're the deck that can actually cast expensive spells before anybody else, and the only reason that I think this deck isn't as strong is just because of the sideboard cards. There's a lot of Consigned Memory and Obsidian Charmlaw are two big ones that really like fight against Tron, and if either one of those weren't there, I think Tron might be honestly too strong. The next one on the list is a little different. I'm putting Jeskai Control up here. I think the top three decks are what I would consider to be the decks that they're there based on their own power level. So they're decks that, without even looking at the metagame, you could easily come in and assume that these decks are going to be very strong because they have very, very consistent, strong game plans while also having a decent amount of interaction to fight against what your opponent's doing. So they're not totally linear, but they are strong linear decks. And then Jeskai Control is a little bit different because it is a little bit less consistent. You have a little bit of mana trouble when you play the deck. I mean, you've got red, white for Flage, blue for counterspell. Some decks even play invert polarity, and on top of that, you got basic island for your Flage. You've got Arena of Glory or basic planes for your counterspells. It does add up over time, but the reason I have this here is because I think it's one of the best decks set up to beat Boros Energy. You've got Wrath of the Skies, you've got Flage, you've got counterspells, you've got the Ring. Like the game that this deck has against Boros Energy is very strong. And then on top of that, of course, I mean it is. I was saying its mana is a little bit inconsistent, but that's really why it's fourth and not like third or second. It's still a really good deck, and I would definitely be happy playing that. In really any metagame, I think it gets bumped up because of the current metagame we're in, but it will always have a decent amount of game when you have, things like Counterspell, you have the Ring, you have Flage. Like it's a powerful deck as well. Then next up, I think I would go with Through the Breach next. This one is a little bit speculative because I played this deck several times and I have not had very good luck with it, but it keeps putting up challenge results. It keeps top 8ing, and I gotta assume that this is because I'm doing something wrong, keeping bad hands, or just maybe getting unlucky. And because this deck is, everywhere I look, is crushing, except for when I try it. So take that for what you will. But I think it's definitely when you play against it, it's a super scary experience because you know that as early as turn 3, you can have an Emrakul thrown at your face. And the backup plan is just very strong as well. You basically can just back into a Tron plan. And I think it's a very good deck, and you're going to need to have a plan for it here. Next one that I think might be a little bit controversial, I'm putting Amulet Titan. I think the deck is just still strong. Like it always has been a little bit underplayed because of the high skill ceiling of the deck and the low floor of the deck, where if you play it poorly, it's you can feel like the deck is just a pile of land, which it kind of is. It's got like 30 lands in it, but the good players know how to navigate around that, and the bad players don't. So it's always a little bit weird with that type of deck because I think the best players can win with it at all times, and then the bad players can never win with it. But I'm going to put it here. I think one thing that holds me back from saying like this is just the best deck in the format if you're a practice player with it, is the fact that it does have a decent amount of splash hate. And what I mean by that is Boros Energy is playing main deck Blood Moon. A lot of decks are playing Damping Sphere, and other decks are playing things like, Obsidian Charmaw, which is okay against Amulet, but it's still like a card that control can bring in against you that you have to now fight through. And these are all cards that decks already want to be playing because of Tron, and in the case of Damping Sphere, Storm. But then they also just come in and are good against Amulet Titan, and I think that kind of holds it back a little bit. Next up, I've got Dimir Frog. I think that's, I think it's a step behind the other ones because it does suffer from the wrong answer syndrome. Like you're playing Spell Pierce, you're playing Stern Scolding, you're playing things like Spell Snare, and if you draw the right cards, like if you go Spell Snare your 2-drop into Psychic Frog, and then you have Counterspell up, you could just never lose. And then it feels like if you have a Spell Pierce and then you for instance playing against Storm, they play a Ral, and you have a Spell Pierce that you can't use the counter at, and then you have to pass back on turn 2 because you need to leave up your Spell Pierce again for the following turn, and now you have a Psychic Frog rotting in your hand. It just feels like you can never win. And I think that It's a strong enough deck that I think with a bit of practice, and again, I think the skill ceiling here is a little bit higher than average. I think this could be a very strong deck, but wouldn't I wouldn't put it up with the other decks here in terms of um, strength. So moving down to tier two, I'm gonna put Omnat. This might be a little bit of a weird pick, but I think it's always floating around a little bit, and I think this also does benefit a bit from the top deck being Boros, because you got a lot of exile based removal, which is naturally good against Flage and a Johnny, and then also is you just have life gain built into your deck. You have a lot of things that you can do to change up your build and make yourself better against a lot of the top decks. It's very easy to play lots of different sideboard cards. Even I've seen lists that play main deck Force of Vigor, and that kind of, I feel like, speaks to the adaptability of the deck and the ability to just play some seemingly narrow cards in the main deck to help you fight against your bad matchups. And I think this deck is a little bit underrated, and maybe I think right now it's a little bit untuned. I think if there was a more tuned version that was around, then this deck would be going up a lot faster in rankings. Next one, I think some people may be questioning why it's so low at Ruby Storm. This deck has been out in force recently after the bannings. I think a lot of people were excited to try it out again. And I think it's still not great. Like, I've played a lot of decks. When the format first came out, I was playing a lot of decks with, with Trinispheres in the sideboard, Chalice, with Damping Spheres, and like packing a lot of hate to try to beat Ruby Storm. And then, Ruby Storm kind of fell off the map after I did so bad at the Pro Tour. And then recently it's come back, and I haven't really been putting much more hate for it in my sideboard, but I'm still beating it a decent amount of time. So it feels like it's just in a really rough place where it needs to thrive in a metagame where there's not much hate for it, but you're also getting hit by a lot of splash hate, similar to Amulet Titan, where a lot of decks are playing Damping Sphere. Like, it's just a good Damping Sphere is just a really good sideboard card right now, and it's also really good against Storm. Then a lot of decks like Frog and Jeskai are playing Spell Snare, which is insane against Ruby Storm, and they're not really necessarily playing it for Ruby Storm. They're kind of playing it for Gorios or playing it for Boros, but it's also just really good against Ruby Storm. And so I think the deck is probably one of, if you're taking that raw power level, one of the most powerful on this list. But the fact that there are so many ways to disrupt it drops it all the way down to tier 2, I think. And then last for tier 2, I would put Domain Zoo. I think it's Leyline Scion is still a strong deck, and I would be pretty happy playing with that. I think there's a lot of different. I've seen builds playing Psychic Frog, more traditional builds playing Tribal Flames, and I think those decks, I think are very strong. They can close out a game quickly, but it's just a little bit too slow, I think, for the current metagame. You're just not really set up that well to beat Goryo's Vengeance. You're not really that well set up to beat even Control. I feel like should be a good matchup because you have their Wrath of Disguise don't line up very well against Scion. But even then, if you don't have Leyline Scion, you're going to struggle against a lot of these decks, and you can't really count on having Leyline Scion every game because you need to have Leyline in your opener basically for that to work. So that's why I would say it's down here. And then don't play. Unfortunately, I'm going to put Yawgmoth in here. I think I've played against a lot of different Yawgmoth builds, and it's always felt like a pretty easy win whenever it comes up. Um, yeah, I think it's just not in a great spot right now in the metagame, and I think there is still potential for this deck. Um, with there's a lot of new cards like Birthing Ritual and Chthonian Nightmares that should add power to this deck, but doesn't seem like anybody has really figured out a list that incorporates those new pieces well. And so right now, I would say this is a don't play, but I could definitely see if a new list is put together in the Yawgmoth Discord that this one could shoot up easily. All right, and then next one I think is Merfolk. Unless you're a Merfolk grinder who has never played anything else except for Merfolk for the last 10 years, I would not recommend playing this deck. It's a little bit awkward it adds a lot of interaction by playing things like Vidalian Hexcatcher and Flare of Denial. But what those do is they force you to sacrifice your creatures. And Merfolk, other than like Silvergill Adept, it doesn't really have creatures that you want to sacrifice. Like, you got a lot of Lords, you got Tide Shaper, which you really want to stay in play. And so if you're sacrificing your creatures to try to counter spells, to disrupt your opponent's plays, and stop a sweeper, you may have to end up sacrificing 2 or 3 creatures to do that. And it just seems the game plan is a little bit of a non-bow, and I think that's what really pushes it down. I mean, obviously, when you get a good draw, you go, like 1 drop into Lord, and then by the time they're actually ready to put down a sweeper or something like that, then you can flash in a Silvergun or Violent an Adept, draw a card, sacrifice the Adept for a counterspell, and then you just win the game from there. Obviously, those are the dream draws, but I mean, if you're on the draw and your opponent goes Ocelot Pride, you go Vile, and your opponent goes Ajani, like, I feel like you've kind of just already lost that game, and there's nothing that you could have done. Like, turn 1 Vile is your best turn 1. So there's a lot of uphill battles for Merfolk, I think. And I somehow added Mill twice, so I'm going to put it in the don't play twice. Don't play this deck. I put it on here because it still shows up every once in a while. It's still like in the, I think, close to top 10 on the MTG Goldfish page, and it's just never good. Like, it's easy. It's a little bit disruptible through the counterspell decks, and it's a little bit slower than the fast decks like Ocelot Pride and or Boros Energy, and Amulet even can just straight up race them sometimes. And then not only that, but one of the top decks is Through the Breach, which is playing 4 Emrakul, and the 4 Emrakul main deck, and you can't. You can beat that card for sure. Like, I'm not gonna say that it's a just because you have that one card you auto beat Mill, but it makes it so much harder. And I would definitely not want to go into a tournament knowing that if somebody is playing Through the Breach, that I'm going to be struggling against them. And not only that, I think this deck doesn't really have much room to grow, because even if it starts to get a favorable metagame and it starts to go up in people's rankings, people are just going to start playing more sideboard cards for it. Like, any deck can add an Emrakul to the sideboard. And then, so every deck can put a new game plan in place to beat Mill. And that's just a really tough place to be. So I don't think this deck really ever will have the chance to jump into the higher levels. Maybe it can get up to tier 2, but I think that's the max, to be honest. The other decks, I think Merfolk and I think Yawgmoth I could definitely envision a time where they find the right metagame, they find the right build, and then they could jump up all the way to 1A even. But Mill, I can't even envision going past tier 2. So yeah, those are the top decks. Obviously, I'm basing this a little bit on popularity. I think there are a few decks that are floating out there that I've seen. Like for instance, I've seen the Red Black Hollow one. I've seen the Shifting Woodland Omniscience deck. Those are decks that I didn't include because they're not quite as popular as some of these other decks. If those continue to put up good results, those could definitely slot in the upper tiers, depending on obviously how well they do. So let me know if you think I made an egregious call here, if I missed a deck that you think deserves to be high up on the list. And if you liked this video, make sure to please check in on your friends and see how they're doing. Sometimes they may seem like everything's going well, but maybe everything isn't. So it's always a good idea to check in when you can. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.